Chapter 1. Harry Collins, 1997. The telescreen lit up promptly at 8 a.m. Smiling Brad came on with his usual greeting. "Good morning! It's a beautiful day in Chicago." Harry Collins rolled over and twitched off the receiver. "This I doubt," he muttered. He sat up and reached into the closet for his clothing. Visitors, particularly feminine ones, were always exclaiming over the advantages of Harry's apartment. "So convenient," they would say. "Everything's handy, right within reach, and think of all the extra steps you save." Of course, most of them were just being polite and trying to cheer Harry up. They knew damned well that he wasn't living in one room through any choice of his own. The Housing Act was something you just couldn't get around, not in Chicago these days. A bachelor was entitled to one room, no more and no less. And even though Harry was making a speedy buck at the agency, he couldn't hope to beat the regulations. There was only one way to beat them, and that was to get married. Marriage would automatically entitle him to 2 rooms, if he could find them someplace. More than a few of his feminine visitors had hinted at just that, but Harry didn't respond. Marriage was no solution the way he figured it. He knew that he couldn't hope to locate a 2-room apartment any closer than 80 miles away. It was bad enough driving 40 miles to and from work every morning and night without doubling the distance. If he did find a bigger place, that would mean a 3-hour trip each way on one of the commu trains, and the commu trains were murder. The Black Hole of Calcutta on wheels. But then, everything was murder, Harry reflected as he stepped from the toilet to the sink, from the sink to the stove, from the stove to the table. Powdered eggs for breakfast. That was murder, too. But it was a fast, cheap meal, easy to prepare, and the ingredients didn't waste a lot of storage space. The only trouble was, he hated the way they tasted. Harry wished he had time to eat his breakfasts in a restaurant. He could afford the price, but he could not afford to wait in line more than a half an hour or so. His office schedule at the agency started promptly at 10:30, and he didn't get out until 3:30. It was a long, hard 5-hour day. Sometimes he wished he worked in the New Philly area, where a 4-hour day was the rule. But he supposed that wouldn't mean any real savings in time because he'd have to live further out. What was the population of New Philly now? Something like 63 million, wasn't it? Chicago was much smaller, only 38 million this year. This year. Harry shook his head and took a gulp of the instant tea. Yes, this year the population was 38 million, and the boundaries of the community extended north to what used to be the old Milwaukee and south past Gary. What would it be like next year, and the year following? Lately that question had begun to haunt Harry. He couldn't quite figure out why. After all, it was none of his business, really. He had a good job, security, a nice place just 2 hours from the loop. He even drove his own car. What more could he ask? And why did he have to start the day like this with a blinding headache? Harry finished his instant tea and considered the matter. Yes, it was beginning again, just as it had on almost every morning for the past month. He'd sit down at the table, eat his usual breakfast, and end up with a headache. Why? It wasn't the food. For a while he'd deliberately varied his diet, but that didn't make any difference, and he'd had the usual monthly checkup not more than 10 days ago, only to be assured that there was nothing wrong with him. Still, the headaches persisted. Every morning when he'd sit down and jerk his head to the left, like this. That was it, jerking his head to the left. It always seemed to trigger the pain, but why? And where had he picked up this habit of jerking his head to the left? Harry didn't know. He glanced at his watch. It was almost 9 now. High time that he got started. He reached over to the intra-department video and dialed the garage downstairs. "Bill," he said, "can you bring my car around to number 3? The tiny face in the handscreen grinned sheepishly. "Mr. Collins, ain't it? Gee, I'm sorry, Mr. Collins. Night crew took on a new man. He must have futzed around with the lists, and I can't find your number." Harry sighed. "It's 1873-5, he said. "Light blue Pax, 2-seater. Do you want the license number, too?" "No, just your parking number. I'll recognize it when I see it. But God only knows what level it's on. That night man really—" "Never mind," Harry interrupted. "How soon?" 20 minutes or so. Maybe half an hour." "Half an hour? I'll be late. Hurry it up." Harry clicked the video and shook his head. Half an hour? Well, you had to expect these things if you wanted to be independent and do your own driving today. If he wanted to work his priority through the office, he could get his application honored on the IC line within a month, but the IC was just another commu train, and he couldn't take it. standing and swaying for almost 2 hours, fighting the crowds, battling his way in and out of the sidewalk escalators. Besides, there was always the danger of being crushed. He'd seen an old man trampled to death on a Michigan Boulevard escalator feeder, and he'd never forgotten it. Being afraid was only a partial reason for his reluctance to change. The worst thing for Harry was the thought of all those people. The forced bodily contact, the awareness of smothered breathing, odors, and the crushing confinement of flesh against flesh. It was bad enough in the lines or on the streets. The commutrain was just too much. Yet, as a small boy, Harry could remember the day when he loved such trips. Sitting there looking out of the window as the scenery whirled past. That was always a thrill when you were a kid. How long ago had that been? More than 20 years, wasn't it? Now there weren't any seats and no windows. Which was just as well, probably, because the scenery didn't whirl past anymore either. Instead, there was a stop at every station on the line and a constant battle as people jockeyed for position to reach the exit doors in time. No, the car was better. Harry reached for a container in the cabinet and poured out a couple of aspiristamines. That ought to help the headache, at least until he got to the office. Then he could start with the daily quota of yellow jackets. Meanwhile, getting out on the street might help him too. A shame there wasn't a window in this apartment, but then what good would it do, really? All he could see through it would be the next apartment. He shrugged and picked up his coat. 9:30, time to go downstairs. Maybe the car would be located sooner than Bill had promised. After all, he had 9 assistants, and not everybody went to work on this first daylight shift. Harry walked down the hall and punched the elevator button. He looked at the indicator, watched the red band move towards the numeral of this floor, then sweep past it. Full up, he muttered. Oh well. He reached out and touched both sides of the corridor. That was another thing he disliked, these narrow corridors. 2 people could scarcely squeeze past one another without touching. Of course, it did save space to build apartments this way, and space was at a premium, but Harry couldn't get used to it. Now he remembered some of the old buildings that were still around when he was a little boy. The headache seemed to be getting worse instead of better. Harry looked at the indicator above the other elevator entrance. The red band was crawling upward, passing him to stop on 48. That was the top floor. Now it was moving down, down, stopping on 47, 46, 45, 44, 43, and here it was. Stand back, please, said the tape. Harry did his best to oblige, but there wasn't much room. A good 24 of his upstairs neighbors jammed into the compartment. Harry thought he recognized 1 or 2 of the men, but he couldn't be sure. There were so many people and so many faces. After a while it got so they all seemed to look alike. Yes, and breathed alike, and felt alike when you were squeezed up against them. And you were always being squeezed up against them, wherever you went. And you could smell them, and hear them wheeze and cough, and you went falling down with them into a bottomless pit where your head began to throb, and it was hard to move away from all the heat and pressure. It was hard enough just to keep from screaming. Then the door opened, and Harry was catapulted out into the lobby. The mob behind him pushed and clawed because they were in a hurry. They were always in a hurry these days, and if you got in their way, they'd trample you down like that old man had been trampled down. There was no room for one man in a crowd any more. Harry blinked and shook his head. He gripped the edge of the wall and clung there in an effort to avoid being swept out of the lobby completely. His hands were sticky with perspiration. They slipped off as he slowly inched his way back through the crush of the mob. "Wait for me," he called. "Wait for me, I'm going down." But his voice was lost in the maelstrom of sound, just as his body was lost in the maelstrom of motion. Besides, an automatic elevator cannot hear. It is merely a mechanism that goes up and down, just like other mechanisms that go in and out, or around, and you get caught up in them the way a squirrel gets caught up in a squirrel cage, and you race, and the best you can hope for is to keep up with the machinery. The elevator door clanged shut before Harry could reach it. He waited for another car to arrive, and this time he stood aside as the crowd emerged, then darted in behind them. The car descended to the first garage level, and Harry stood gulping gratefully in the comparative isolation. There weren't more than 10 people accompanying him. He emerged on the ramp, gave his number to the attendant, and waved at Bill in his office. Bill seemed to recognize him. At least he nodded briefly. No sense trying to talk, not in this sullen subterranea filled with the booming echo of exhausts, the despairing shriek of brakes. Headlights flickered in the darkness as cars whirled past, ascending and descending on the loading platforms. The signal systems winked from the walls, and the tires screeched defiance to the warning bells. Old-fashioned theologians, Harry remembered, used to argue whether there really was a hell, and if so, had it been created by God or the devil. Too bad they weren't around today to get an answer to their question. There was a hell, and it had been created by General Motors. Harry's temples began to throb. Through the blurred eyes he saw the attendant beckoning him down the line to a platform marked Checkout Number 3. He stood there with a cluster of others, waiting. What was the matter with him today, anyway? First the headache, and now his feet were hurting. Standing around waiting, that's what did it. This eternal waiting. When he was a kid, the grown-ups were always complaining about the long 7-hour workdays and how they cut into their leisure time. Well, maybe they had reason to gripe, but at least there was some leisure before work began or after it was through. Now that extra time was consumed in waiting, standing in line, standing in crowds, wearing yourself out, doing nothing. Still, this time it wasn't really so bad. Within 10 minutes the light blue Pax rolled up before him. Harry climbed in as the attendant slid out from behind the wheel and prepared to leave. Then a fat man appeared, running along the ramp. He gestured wildly with a plump thumb. Harry nodded briefly, and the fat man hurled himself into the seat beside him and slammed the door. They were off. Harry read the signals impatiently, waiting for the green "Go." The moment he saw it, he gunned his motor and got the car up to 22 and zipped away. That's what he liked. That's what he always waited for. Of course it was dangerous, here in the tunnel system under the garage, but Harry always got a thrill out of speed. The Pax could do 35 or even 40, probably on a theoretically open road. Still, 22 was enough to satisfy Harry. He whizzed up the ramp, turned, headed for the street level, then braked and waited for the signal to emerge. Harsh sunlight pierced the smog, and he felt his eyes watering. Now the street noises assailed his ears, the grinding of gears, the revving of motors, but at least the total volume was lower, and with the windows tightly closed against the acrid air, he could hear. Turning to the fat man beside him, he said, "Hello, Fraser. What's the urgency?" "Got to get downtown before 11, the fat man answered. "Board meeting today, but I forgot about it. Knew I wouldn't have time to wait for the car, and I was hoping I'd find someone who'd give me a lift. Lucky for me that you came along when you did." Harry nodded, but did not reply. At the moment he was trying to edge into the traffic beyond. It flowed, bumper to bumper, in a steady stream, a stream moving at the uniform and prescribed rate of 15 miles per hour. He released his brakes, and the Pax nosed forward until a truck sounded its horn in ominous warning. The noise hurt Harry's head. He winced and grimaced. "What's the matter?" asked Fraser. "Headache," Harry muttered. He menaced a Chevy Soto with his bumper. "Damn it, I thought they didn't allow those big 4-passenger jobs on this arterial during rush hours." Gradually he managed to turn until he was in the right-hand lane. "There," he said, "we're off." And so they were, for all of 3 minutes, with the speed set at 15 on autopilot. Then a signal went into action somewhere up ahead, and the procession halted. Harry flicked his switch. As was customary, horns sounded indignantly on all sides, a mechanical protest against a mechanical obstruction. Harry winced again. "Hangover?" Fraser asked solicitously. "Try aspirystamine." Harry shook his head. "No hangover, and I've already taken 3, thanks. Nothing does any good, so I guess it's just up to you." "Up to me?" Fraser was genuinely puzzled. "What can I do about your headaches? You're on the board of city planners, aren't you?" "That's right." "Well, I've got a suggestion for you to give them. Tell them to start planning to drop a couple of heavy thermonukes on this area. Clean out 20 or 30 million people. We'd never miss them." Fraser chuckled wryly. "I wish I had $1 for every time I've heard that suggestion." Ever stop to think why you hear it so often? It's because everybody feels the same way. We can't take being hemmed in like this. "Well, a bomb wouldn't help you. You know that." Fraser pursed his lips. "Robertson figured out what would happen with the chain reaction." Harry glanced sideways at his companion as the car started forward once again. "I've always wondered about that," he said. "Seriously, I mean, is the story really true, or is it just some more of this government propaganda you fellows like to hand out?" Fraser sighed. "It's true, all right. There was a scientist named Robertson, and he did come up with the thermonuke formula way back in '75. Proved it, too. Use what he developed and the chain reaction would never end. Scientists in other countries tested the theory and agreed. There was no collusion. It just worked out that way on a practical basis. Hasn't been a war since. What more proof do you want?" Well, couldn't they just use some of the old-fashioned hydrogen bombs? Be sensible, man. Once a war started, no nation could resist the temptation to go all out. Fortunately, everyone realizes that, so we have peace. Permanent peace. I'll take a good war any time in preference to this. Harry, you don't know what you're talking about. You aren't so young that you can't remember what it was like in the old days. Everybody living in fear, waiting for the bombs to fall. People dying of disease and worrying about dying from radiation and fallout. All the international rivalries, the power politics, the eternal pressures and constant crises. Nobody in his right mind would want to go back to that. We've come a mighty long way in the last 20 years or so. Harry switched to autopilot and sat back. Maybe that's the trouble, he said. Maybe we've come too far too fast. I wasn't kidding about dropping those thermonukes either. Something has to be done. We can't go on like this indefinitely. Why doesn't the board come up with an answer? Fraser shrugged his heavy shoulders. You think we haven't tried, aren't trying now? We're aware of the situation as well as you are, and then some. But there's no easy solution. The population just keeps growing, that's all. No war to cut it down. Contagious diseases at a minimum, average life expectancy up to 90 years or better. Naturally, this results in a problem. But a bomb won't help bring about any permanent solution. Besides, this isn't a local matter, or even a national one. It's global. What do you think those summit meetings are all about? What about birth control? Harry asked. And why don't they really get behind an emigration movement? We can't limit procreation by law, you know that. Fraser peered out at the swarming streams on the sidewalk levels. It's more than a religious or a political question. It's a social one. People want kids. They can't afford them. Besides, the Housing Act is set up so that having kids is just about the only way you can ever get into larger living quarters. Couldn't they try reverse psychology? I mean, grant priority to people who are willing to be sterilized. They tried it on a limited experimental scale about 3 years ago out on the West Coast. I never heard anything about it. Damned right you didn't, Fraser replied grimly. They kept the whole project under wraps, and for a good reason. The publicity might have wrecked the administration. What happened? What do you suppose happened? There were riots. Do you think a man and his wife and 3 kids living in 3 rooms liked the idea of standing by and watching a sterilized couple enjoy a 4-room place with lawn space? Things got pretty ugly, let me tell you. There was a rumor going around that the country was in the hands of homosexuals. The churches were up in arms, and if that wasn't bad enough, we had to face up to the primary problem. There just isn't enough space. Not in areas suitable for maintaining a population. Mountains are still mountains and deserts are still deserts. Maybe we can put up housing in such regions. But who can live there? Even with decentralization going full blast, people must live within reasonable access to their work. No, we're just running out of room. Again the car halted on signal. Over the blasting of the horns, Harry repeated his query about emigration. Fraser shook his head, but made no attempt to reply until the horns had quieted and they were under way once more. As for emigration, we're just getting some of our own medicine in return. About 80 years ago we clamped down and closed the door on immigrants, established a quota. Now the same quota is being used against us, and you can't really blame other nations for it. They're facing worse population increases than we are. Look at the African Federation, and what's happening there in spite of all the wealth. And South America is even worse, in spite of all the reclamation projects. 15 years ago, when they cleared out the Amazon basin, they thought they'd have enough room for 50 years to come. And now look at it. 200 million. That's the latest figures we've got. So, what's the answer? Harry asked. I don't know. If it wasn't for hydroponics and the ag culture controls, we'd be licked right now. As it is, we can still supply enough food, and the odd supply and demand takes care of the economy as a whole. I have no recommendations for an overall solution, or even a regional one. My job, the board's job, is regulating housing and traffic and transportation in Chicago. That's about all you can expect us to handle. Again they jolted to a stop, and the horns howled all around them. Harry sat there until a muscle in the side of his jaw began to twitch. Suddenly he pounded on the horn with both fists. "Shut up!" he yelled. "For the love of heaven, shut up!" Abruptly he slumped back. "Sorry," he mumbled. "It's my damned headache. I've got to get out of this." "Job getting you down?" No, it's a good job. At least everybody tells me so. 25 hours a week, $300, the car, the room, the telescreen, and liquor and yellow jackets. Plenty of time to kill, unless it's the time that's killing me. But what do you want? Harry stepped on the accelerator and they inched along. Now the street widened into 8 traffic lanes, and the big semis joined the procession on the edge of the downtown area. I want out, Harry said. Out of this. Don't you ever visit the National Preserves? Fraser asked. Sure I do. Fly up every vacation, take a tame plane to a tame government resort, and catch my quota of 2 tame fish. Great sport. If I got married, I'd be entitled to 4 tame fish. But that's not what I want. I want what my father used to talk about. I want to drive into the country without a permit, mind you, just to drive wherever I like. I want to see cows and chickens and trees and lakes and sky. You sound like a naturalist. Don't sneer. Maybe the naturalists are right. Maybe we ought to cut out all this phony progress and phony peace that passeth all understanding. I'm no liberal, don't get me wrong, but sometimes I think the naturalists have the only answer. But what can you do about it? Fraser murmured. Suppose for the sake of argument that they are right. How can you change things? We can't just will ourselves to stop growing, and we can't legislate against biology. More people in better health with more free time are just bound to have more offspring. It's inevitable under the circumstances. And neither you nor I nor anyone has the right to condemn millions upon millions of others to death through war or disease. I know, Harry said. It's hopeless, I guess. All the same, I want out. He wet his lips. Fraser, you're on the board here. You've got connections higher up. If I could only get a chance to transfer to ag culture, go on one of those farms as a worker. Fraser shook his head. Sorry, Harry. You know the situation there, I'm sure. Right now there's roughly 90 million approved applications on file. Everybody wants to get into ag culture. But couldn't I just buy some land and get a government contract for foodstuffs? Have you got the bucks? A minimum 40 acres leased from one of the farm corporations will cost you $200,000 at the very least, not counting equipment. He paused. Besides, there's vocational apt. What did your tests show? You're right, Harry said. I'm supposed to be an agency man until I die, or retire on my pension at 50 and sit in my little room for the next 50 years, turning to the telescreen every morning to hear some loudmouthed liar tell me it's a beautiful day in Chicago. Who knows? Maybe by that time we'll have 100 billion people enjoying peace and progress and prosperity, all sitting in little rooms and... Watch out! Fraser grabbed the wheel. You nearly hit that truck. He waited until Harry's face relaxed before relinquishing his grip. Harry, you'd better go in for a checkup. It isn't just a headache with you, is it? You're not fooling, Harry told him. It isn't just a headache. He began to think about what it really was, and that helped a little. It helped get him through the worst part, which was the downtown traffic and letting Fraser off and listening to Fraser urge him to see a doctor. Then he got to the building parking area and let them take his car away and bury it down in the droning darkness where the horns hooted and the headlights glared. Harry climbed the ramp and mingled with the 10:30 shift on its way to the elevators. 18 elevators in his building to serve 80 floors. 9 of the elevators were express to the 15th floor. 3 were express to 65. He wanted one of the latter, and so did the mob. The crushing, clinging mob. They pressed and panted the way mobs always do. Mobs that lynch and torture and dance around bonfires and guillotines and try to drag you down to trample you to death because they can't stand you if your name is Harry and you want to be different. They hate you because you don't like powdered eggs and the telescreen and a beautiful day in Chicago. And they stare at you because your forehead hurts and the muscle in your jaw twitches, and they know you want to scream as you go up, 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 and try to think why you get a headache from jerking your head to the left. Then Harry was at the office door, and they said good morning when he came in, all 80 of the typists in their outer office working their electronic machines and offering him their electronic smiles, including the girl he had made electronic love to last Saturday night, and who wanted him to move into a 2-room marriage and have children, lots of children, who could enjoy peace and progress and prosperity. Harry snapped out of it, going down the corridor. Only a few steps more and he'd be safe in his office, his own private office, almost as big as his apartment. And there would be liquor and the yellow jackets in the drawer. That would help. Then he could get to work. What was today's assignment? He tried to remember. It was Wilmer Kibbe, wasn't it? Telescreen ads for Wilmer Kibbe, makers of window glass. Window glass. He opened his office door and then slammed it shut behind him. For a minute everything blurred, and then he could remember. Now he knew what caused him to jerk his head, and what gave him the headaches when he did so. Of course, that was it. When he sat down at the table for breakfast in the morning, he turned his head to the left, because he'd always done so, ever since he was a little boy in what was then Wheaton, sitting at the breakfast table and looking out of the window, looking at summer sunshine, spring rain, autumn haze, the white wonder of new-fallen snow. He'd never broken himself of the habit. He still looked to the left every morning, just as he had today, but there was no window anymore. There was only a blank wall, and beyond it the smog and the clamor of the crowds. Window glass. Wilmer Kibbe had problems. Nobody was buying window glass anymore. Nobody except the people who put up buildings like this. There were still windows on the top floors, just like the window here in his office. Harry stepped over to it, moving very slowly because of his head. It hurt to keep his eyes open, but he wanted to stare out of the window. Up this high you could see above the smog, you could see the sun like a radiant jewel packed in the cotton cumulus of clouds. If you opened the window you could feel fresh air against your forehead. You could breathe it in and breathe out the headache. But you didn't dare look down. Oh no, never look down, because then you see the buildings all around you, the buildings below, black and sooty, their jagged outlines like the stumps of rotten teeth. And they stretched off in all directions as far as the eye could attain, row after row of rotten teeth grinning up from the smog-choked throat of the streets. From the maw of the city far below came this faint but endless howling, this screaming of traffic and toil. And you couldn't help it. You breathed that in too, along with the fresh air, and it poisoned you, and it did more than make your head ache. It made your heart ache, and it made your soul sick, and it made you close your eyes and your lungs and your brain against it. Harry reeled, but he knew this was the only way. Close your brain against it, and then, when you opened your eyes again, maybe you could see the way things used to be. It was snowing out, and it was a wet snow, the very best kind for snowballs and making snowmen, and the whole gang would come out after school. But there was no school. This was Saturday, and the leaves were russet and gold and red so that it looked as if all the trees in the world were on fire, and you could scuff them when you walked and pile up fallen leaves from the grass and roll in them. And it was swell to roll down the front lawn in summer. Just roll right down to the edge of the sidewalk like it was a big hill and let Daddy catch you at the bottom laughing. Mama laughed too, and she said, "Look, it's springtime. The lilacs are out. Do you want to touch the pretty lilacs, Harry?" And Harry didn't quite understand what she was saying, but he reached out, and they were purple and smelled of rain and soft sweetness, and they were just beyond the window. If he reached a little further, he could touch them. And then the snow and the leaves and the grass and the lilacs disappeared, and Harry could see the rotten teeth again, leering and looming and snapping at him. They were going to bite. They were going to chew. They were going to devour, and he could not stop them. Couldn't stop himself. He was falling into the howling jaws of the city. His last conscious effort was a desperate attempt to gulp fresh air into his lungs before he pinwheeled down. Fresh air was good for headaches. End of Chapter 1 of This Crowded Earth by Robert Bloch. Chapter 2 Harry Collins, 1998. It took them 10 seconds to save Harry from falling, but it took him over 10 weeks to regain his balance. In fact, over 2 months had passed before he could fully realize just what had happened or where he was now. They must have noticed something was wrong with him that morning at the office, because 2 supervisors and an exec rushed in and caught him just as he was going out the window. And then they had sent him away, sent him here. "This is fine," he told Dr. Manshoff. "If I'd known how well they treated you, I'd have gone couch happy years ago." Dr. Manshoff's plump face was impassive, but the little laugh lines deepened around the edges of his eyes. "Maybe that's why we take such care not to publicize our recent advances in mental therapy," he said. "Everybody would want to get into a treatment center, and then where would we be?" Harry nodded, staring past the doctor's shoulder, staring out of the wide window at the broad expanse of rolling countryside beyond. "I still don't understand, though," he murmured. "How can you possibly manage to maintain an institution like this, with all the space and the luxuries? The inmates seem to lead better lives than the adjusted individuals outside. It's topsy-turvy." "Perhaps." Dr. Manshoff's fingers formed a pudgy steeple. "But then, so many things seem to be topsy-turvy nowadays, don't they? Wasn't it the realization of this fact which precipitated your own recent difficulties?" "Almost precipitated me bodily out of that window," Harry admitted cheerfully. "And that's another thing. I was sent here, I suppose, because I'd attempted suicide, gone into shock, temporary amnesia, something like that." "Something like that," the doctor echoed, contemplating his steeple. "But you didn't give me any treatment," Harry continued. "Oh, I was kept under sedation for a while, I realize that, and you and some of the other staff members talked to me. But mainly I just rested in a nice big room and ate nice big meals." "So?" The steeple's fleshy spire collapsed. "So what I want to know is, when does the real treatment start? When do I go into analysis or chemotherapy and all that?" Dr. Manshoff shrugged. "Do you think you need those things right now?" Harry gazed out at the sunlight beyond the window, half squinting and half frowning. "No, come to think of it, I don't believe I do. I feel better now than I have in years." His companion leaned back. "Meaning that for years you felt all wrong, because you were constricted, physically, psychically, and emotionally. You were cramped, squeezed in a vice until the pressure became intolerable. But now that pressure has been removed. As a result, you no longer suffer, and there is no need to seek escape in death or denial of identity. This radical change of attitude has been brought about here in just a little more than 2 months' time, and yet you're asking me when the real treatment begins." "I guess I've already had the real treatment then, haven't I?" "That is correct. Prolonged analysis or drastic therapy is unnecessary. We've merely given you what you seemed to need." "I'm very grateful," Harry said, "but how can you afford to do it?" Dr. Manshoff built another temple to an unknown god. He inspected the architecture critically now as he spoke. "Because your problem is a rarity," he said. "Rarity? I'd have thought millions of people would be breaking down every month. The naturalists say—" The doctor nodded wearily. "I know what they say, but let's dismiss rumors and consider facts. Have you ever read any official report stating that the number of cases of mental illness ran into the millions?" "No, I haven't." "For that matter, do you happen to know of anyone who was ever sent to a treatment center such as this?" "Well, of course, everybody goes in to see the medics for regular checkups, and this includes an interview with a psych. But if they're in bad shape, he just puts them on extra tranquilizers. I guess sometimes he reviews their vocational apt tests and shifts them over into different jobs in other areas." Dr. Manshoff bowed his head in reverence above the steeple, as if satisfied with the labors he had wrought. "That is roughly correct, and I believe, if you search your memory, you won't recall even a mention of a treatment center. This sort of place is virtually extinct nowadays. There are still some institutions for those suffering from functional mental disorders, paresis, senile dementia, congenital abnormalities, but regular checkups and preventative therapy take care of the great majority. We've ceased concentrating on the result of mental illness and learned to attack the causes. It's the old yellow fever problem all over again, you see. Once upon a time, physicians dealt exclusively with treatment of yellow fever patients. Then they shifted their attention to the source of the disease. They went after the mosquitoes, drained the swamps, and the yellow fever problem vanished. That's been our approach in recent years. We've developed social therapy, and so the need for individual therapy has diminished. What were the sources of the tensions producing mental disturbances? Physical and financial security, the threat of war, the aggressive patterns of a competitive society, the unresolved Oedipus situation rooted in the old-style family relationship. These were the swamps where the mosquitoes buzzed and bit. Most of the swamps have been dredged, most of the insects exterminated. Today we're moving into a social situation where nobody goes hungry, nobody is jobless or unprovided for, nobody needs to struggle for status. Vocational apt determines a man's rightful place and function in society, and there's no longer the artificial distinction imposed by race, color, or creed. War is a thing of the past. Best of all, the old-fashioned home life, with all of its unhealthy emotional ties, is being replaced by sensible conditioning when a child reaches school age. The umbilical cord is no longer a permanent leash, a strangler's noose, or a silver-plated lifeline stretching back to the womb." Harry Collins nodded. "I suppose only the exceptional cases ever need to go to a treatment center like this." "Exactly. But what makes me one of the exceptions? Is it because of the way the folks brought me up in a small town with all the old-fashioned books and everything? Is that why I hated confinement and conformity so much? Is it because of all the years I spent reading? And why—" Dr. Manshoff stood up. "You tempt me," he said. "You tempt me strongly, as you can see. I dearly love a lecture, and a captive audience. But right now, the audience must not remain captive. I prescribe an immediate dose of freedom." "You mean I'm to leave here?" "Is that what you want to do?" "Frankly, no. Not if it means going back to my job." "That hasn't been decided upon. We can discuss the problem later, and perhaps we can go into the answers to those questions you just posed. But at the moment, I'd suggest you stay with us, though without the restraint of remaining in your room or in the wards. In other words, I want you to start going outside again." "Outside?" "You'll find several square miles of open country just beyond the doors here. You're at liberty to wander around and enjoy yourself. Plenty of fresh air and sunshine. Come and go as you wish. I've already issued instructions which permit you to keep your own hours. Meals will be available when you desire them." "You're very kind." "Nonsense. I'm prescribing what you need, and when the time comes, we'll arrange to talk again. You know where to find me." Dr. Manshoff dismantled his steeple and placed a half of the roof in each trouser pocket. And Harry Collins went outdoors. It was wonderful just to be free and alone, like returning to that faraway childhood in Wheaton once again. Harry appreciated every minute of it during the first week of his wandering. But Harry wasn't a child anymore, and after a week he began to wonder instead of wander. The grounds around the treatment center were more than spacious. They seemed absolutely endless. No matter how far he walked during the course of a day, Harry never encountered any walls, fences, or artificial boundaries. There was nothing to stay his progress but the natural barriers of high, steeply slanting precipices which seemed to rim all sides of a vast valley. Apparently the center itself was set in the middle of a large canyon, a canyon big enough to contain an airstrip for helicopter landings. The single paved road leading from the main buildings terminated at the strip, and Harry saw helicopters arrive and depart from time to time. Apparently they brought in food and supplies. As for the center itself, it consisted of 4 large structures, 2 of which Harry was familiar with. The largest was made up of apartments for individual patients and staffed by nurses and attendants. Harry's own room was here, on the 2nd floor, and from the beginning he'd been allowed to roam around the communal halls below at will. The second building was obviously administrative. Dr. Manshoff's private office was situated therein, and presumably the other staff members operated out of here. The other 2 buildings were apparently inaccessible, not guarded or policed or even distinguished by signs prohibiting access, but merely locked and unused. At least, Harry had found the doors locked when, out of normal curiosity, he had ventured to approach them. Nor had he ever seen anyone enter or leave the premises. Perhaps these structures were unnecessary under the present circumstances and had been built for future accommodations. Still, Harry couldn't help wondering. And now, on this particular afternoon, he sat on the bank of the little river which ran through the valley, feeling the midsummer sun beating down upon his forehead and staring down at the eddying current with its ripples and reflections. Ripples and reflections. Dr. Manshoff had answered his questions well, yet new questions had arisen. Most people didn't go crazy anymore, the doctor had explained, and so there were very few treatment centers such as this. Question: why were there any at all? A place like this cost a fortune to staff and maintain. In an age where living space and arable acreage was at such a premium, why waste this vast and fertile expanse? And in a society more and more openly committed to the policy of promoting the greatest good for the greatest number, why bother about the fate of an admittedly insignificant group of mentally disturbed patients? Not that Harry resented his situation. In fact, it was almost too good to be true. Question: was it too good to be true? Why, come to realize it, he'd seen less than a dozen other patients during his entire stay here. All of them were male, and all of them apparently were recovering from a condition somewhat similar to his own. At least, he'd recognized the same reticence and diffidence when it came to exchanging more than a perfunctory greeting in an encounter in an outer corridor. At the time he'd accepted their unwillingness to communicate, welcomed and understood it because of his condition, and that in itself wasn't what he questioned now. But why were there so few patients besides himself? Why were they all males? And why weren't they roaming the countryside now the way he was? So many staff members and so few patients, so much room and luxury and freedom and so little use of it, so little apparent purpose to it all. Question: was there a hidden purpose? Harry stared down into the ripples and reflections, and the sun was suddenly intolerably hot, its glare on the water suddenly blinding and bewildering. He saw his face mirrored on the water's surface, and it was not the familiar countenance he knew. The features were bloated, distorted, shimmering, and wavering. Maybe it was starting all over again. Maybe he was getting another one of those headaches. Maybe he was going to lose control again. Yes, and maybe he was just imagining things. Sitting here in all this heat wasn't a good idea. Why not take a swim? That seemed reasonable enough. In fact, it seemed like a delightful distraction. Harry rose and stripped. He entered the water awkwardly. One didn't dive, not after 20 years of abstinence from the outdoor life. But he found that he could swim after a fashion. The water was cooling, soothing. A few minutes of immersion, and Harry found himself forgetting his speculations. The uneasy feeling had vanished. Now, when he stared down into the water, he saw his own face reflected, looking just the way it should. And when he stared up, he saw her standing there on the bank. She was tall, slim, and blonde. Very tall, very slim, and very blonde. She was also very desirable. Up until a moment ago, Harry had considered swimming a delightful distraction, but now... "How's the water?" she called. "Fine." She nodded, smiling down at him. "Aren't you coming in?" he asked. "No." "Then what are you doing here?" "I was looking for you, Harry." "You know my name?" She nodded again. "Dr. Manshoff told me." "You mean he sent you here to find me?" "That's right." "But I don't understand. If you're not going swimming, then why... I mean..." Her smile broadened. "It's just part of the therapy, Harry." "Part of the therapy?" "That's right, part," she giggled. "Don't you think you'd like to come out of the water now and see what the rest of it might be?" Harry thought so. With mounting enthusiasm, he eagerly embraced his treatment and entered into a state of active cooperation. It was some time before he ventured to comment on the situation. "Manshoff is a damned good diagnostician," he murmured. Then he sat up. "Are you a patient here?" She shook her head. "Don't ask questions, Harry. Can't you be satisfied with things as they are?" "You're just what the doctor ordered, all right." He gazed down at her. "But don't you even have a name?" "You can call me Sue." "Thank you." He bent to kiss her, but she avoided him and rose to her feet. "Got to go now." "So soon?" She nodded and moved towards the bushes above the bank. "But when will I see you again?" "Coming swimming tomorrow?" "Yes." "Maybe I can get away for more occupational therapy then." She stooped behind the bushes, and Harry saw a flash of white. "You are a nurse, aren't you?" he muttered. "On the staff, I suppose. I should have known." "All right, so I am. What's that got to do with it? And I suppose you were telling the truth when you said Manshoff sent you here. This is just part of my therapy, isn't it?" She nodded briefly as she slipped into her uniform. "Does that bother you, Harry?" He bit his lip. When he spoke, his voice was low. "Yes, damn it. It does. I mean, I got the idea, at least I was hoping, that this wasn't just a matter of carrying out an assignment on your part." She looked up at him gravely. "Who said anything about an assignment, darling?" she murmured. "I volunteered." And then she was gone. Then she was gone, and then she came back that night in Harry's dreams, and then she was at the river the next day, and it was better than the dreams, better than the day before. Sue told him she had been watching him for weeks now. She had gone to Manshoff and suggested it, and she was very glad, and they had to meet here, out in the open, so as not to complicate the situation or disturb any of the other patients. So Harry naturally asked her about the other patients and the whole general setup, and she said Dr. Manshoff would answer all those questions in due time. But right now, with only an hour or so to spare, was he going to spend it all asking for information? Matters were accordingly adjusted to their mutual satisfaction, and it was on that basis that they continued their almost daily meetings for some time. The next few months were perhaps the happiest Harry had ever known. The whole interval took on a dreamlike quality, idealized, romanticized, and yet basically sensual. There is probably such a dream buried deep within the psyche of every man, Harry reflected, but to few is it ever given to realize its reality. His early questioning attitude gave way to a mood of mere acceptance and enjoyment. This was the primitive drama, the very essence of the male-female relationship. Adam and Eve in the garden. Why waste time seeking the tree of knowledge? And it wasn't until summer passed that Harry even thought about the serpent. One afternoon, as he sat waiting for Sue on the riverbank, he heard a sudden movement in the brush behind him. "Darling?" he called eagerly. "Please, you don't know me that well." The deep masculine voice carried overtones of amusement. Flushing, Harry turned to confront the intruder. He was a short, stocky, middle-aged man whose bristling gray crew cut almost matched the neutral shades of his gray orderly's uniform. "Expecting someone else, were you?" the man muttered. "Well, I'll get out of your way." "That's not necessary. I was really just daydreaming, I guess. I don't know what made me think." Harry felt his flush deepen, and he lowered his eyes and his voice as he tried to improvise some excuse. "You're a lousy liar," the man said, stepping forward and seating himself on the bank next to Harry. "But it doesn't really matter. I don't think your girlfriend is going to show up today anyway." "What do you mean? What do you know about—" "I mean just what I said," the man told him. "And I know everything I need to know about you and about her and about the situation in general. That's why I'm here, Collins." He paused, watching the play of emotions in Harry's eyes. "I know what you're thinking right now," the gray-haired man continued. "At first you wondered how I knew your name. Then you realized that if I was on the staff in the wards, I'd naturally be able to identify the patients. Now it occurs to you that you've never seen me in the wards. So you're speculating as to whether or not I'm working out of the administration offices with that psychiatric no-good Manshoff. But if I were, I wouldn't be calling him names, would I? Which means you're really getting confused, aren't you, Collins? Good." The man chuckled, but there was neither mockery, malice, nor genuine mirth in the sound, and his eyes were sober, intent. "Who are you?" Harry asked. "What are you doing here?" "The name is Ritchie, Arnold Ritchie. At least, that's the name they know me by around here, and you can call me that. As to what I'm doing, it's a long story. Let's just say that right now I'm here to give you a little advanced therapy. Then Manshoff did send you." The chuckle came again, and Ritchie shook his head. "He did not. And if he even suspected I was here, there'd be hell to pay." "Then what do you want with me?" "It isn't a question of what I want. It's a question of what you need. Which is, like I said, advanced therapy. The sort that dear old kindly permissive Father Image Manshoff doesn't intend you to get." Harry stood up. "What's this all about?" Ritchie rose with him, smiling for the first time. "I'm glad you asked that question, Collins. It's about time you did, you know. Everything has been so carefully planned to keep you from asking it. But you were beginning to wonder. Just a bit, anyway, weren't you?" "I don't see what you're driving at." "You don't see what anyone is driving at, Collins. You've been blinded by a spectacular display of kindness, misdirected by self-indulgence. I told you, I knew everything I needed to know about you, and I do. Now I'm going to ask you to remember these things for yourself, the things you've avoided considering all this while. I'm going to ask you to remember that you're 28 years old, and that for almost 7 years you were an agency man, and a good one. You worked hard, you did a conscientious job, you stayed in line, obeyed the rules, never rebelled. Am I correct in my summary of the situation?" "Yes, I guess so." "So what was your reward for all this unceasing effort and eternal conformity? A one-room apartment and a 1-week vacation once a year. Count your blessings, Collins. Am I right?" "Right." "Then what happened? Finally you flipped out, didn't you? You tried to take a header out of the window. You chucked your job, chucked your responsibilities, chucked your future, and attempted to chuck yourself away. Am I still right?" "Yes." "Good enough. And now we come to the interesting part of the story. 7 years of being a good little boy got you nothing but the promise of present and future frustration. 7 seconds of madness, of attempted self-destruction, brought you here. And as a reward for bucking the system itself has provided you with a life of luxury and leisure, full permission to come and go as you please, live in spacious ease, indulge in the gratification of every appetite, free of responsibility or restraint. Is that true?" "I suppose so." "All right. Now let me ask you the question you asked me. What's it all about?" Ritchie put his hand on Harry's shoulder. "Tell me, Collins, why do you suppose you've received such treatment? As long as you stayed in line, nobody gave a damn for your comfort or welfare. Then, when you committed the cardinal sin of our present-day society, when you rebelled, everything was handed to you on a silver platter. Does that make sense?" "But it's therapy. Dr. Manshoff said—" Look, Collins, millions of people flip every year. Millions more attempt suicide. How many of them end up in a place like this? They don't, though. That's just naturalist propaganda. Dr. Manshoff said, I know what he said all right, and you believed him, because you wanted to believe him. You wanted the reassurance he could offer you, the feeling of being unique and important. So you didn't ask him any questions. You didn't ask any questions of yourself, such as why anybody would consider an insignificant little agency man without friends or family or connections worth the trouble of rehabilitating at all, let alone amidst such elaborate and expensive surroundings. Why, men like you are a dime a dozen these days. Vocational Apt can push a few buttons and come up with 500,000 replacements to take your job. You aren't important to society, Collins. You aren't important to anyone at all besides yourself. And yet you got the red carpet treatment. It's about time somebody yanked that carpet out from under you. What's it all about? Harry blinked. Look here, I don't see why this is any of your business. Besides, to tell the truth, I'm expecting... I know who you're expecting, but I've already told you she won't be here because she's expecting. What? It's high time you learned the facts of life, Collins. Yes, the well-known facts of life. The ones about the birds and the bees and the barefoot boys and blondes, too. Your little friend Sue is going to have a souvenir. I don't believe it. I'm going to ask Dr. Manshoff. Sure you are. You'll ask Manshoff and he'll deny it, and so you'll tell him about me. You'll say you met somebody in the woods today, either a lunatic or a naturalist spy who infiltrated here under false pretenses. And Manshoff will reassure you. He'll reassure you just long enough to get his hands on me. Then he'll take care of both of us. Are you insinuating? Hell no, I'm telling you. Richie put his hand down suddenly and his voice calmed. Ever wonder about those other 2 buildings on the premises here, Collins? Well, I can tell you about one of them because that's where I work. You might call it an experimental laboratory if you like. Sometime later on I'll describe it to you. But right now it's the other building that's important. The building with the big chimney. That's a kind of incinerator, Collins. A place where the mistakes go up in smoke at night when there's nobody to see. A place where you and I will go up in smoke, if you're fool enough to tell Manshoff about this. You're lying. I wish to God I was, for both our sakes. But I can prove what I'm saying. You can prove it, for yourself. How? Pretend this meeting never occurred. Pretend that you just spent the afternoon here waiting for a girl who never showed up. Then do exactly what you would do under those circumstances. Go in to see Dr. Manshoff and ask him where Sue is. Tell him you were worried because she'd promised to meet you and then didn't appear. I can tell you right now what he'll tell you. He'll say that Sue has been transferred to another treatment center, that she knew about it for several weeks but didn't want to upset you with the news of her departure. So she decided to just slip away. And Manshoff will tell you not to be unhappy. It just so happens that he knows of another nurse who has had her eye on you, a very pretty little brunette named Myrna. In fact, if you go down to the river tomorrow, you'll find her waiting for you there. What if I refuse? Richie shrugged. Why should you refuse? It's all fun and games, isn't it? Up to now you haven't asked any questions about what was going on, and it would look very strange if you started at this late date. I strongly advise you to cooperate. If not, everything is likely to, quite literally, go up in smoke. Harry Collins frowned. All right, suppose I do what you say and Manshoff gives me the answers you predict. This still doesn't prove that he'd been lying or that you're telling me the truth. Wouldn't it indicate as much, though? Perhaps, but on the other hand, it could merely mean that you know Sue has been transferred and that Dr. Manshoff intends to turn me over to a substitute. It doesn't necessarily imply anything sinister. In other words, you're insisting on a clincher, is that it? Yes. All right, Richie sighed heavily. You asked for it. He reached into the left-hand upper pocket of the gray uniform and brought out a small, stiff square of glossy paper. What's that? Harry asked. He reached for the paper, but Richie drew his hand back. Look at it over my shoulder, he said. I don't want any fingerprints. Hell of a risky business just smuggling it out of the files. No telling how well they check up on this material. Harry circled behind the smaller man. He squinted down. Hard to read. Sure. It's a photostat. I made it myself this morning. That's my department. Read carefully now. You'll see it's a transcript of the lab report. Susan Pulver. That's her name, isn't it? After due examination and upon completion of preliminary tests, hereby found to be in the 2nd month of pregnancy. Putative father, Harry Collins. That's you. See your name? And here's the rest of the record. Yes, let me see it. What's all this about inoculation series, and who is this Dr. Leffingwell? Harry bent closer, but Richie closed his hand around the photostat and pocketed it again. Never mind that now. I'll tell you later. The important thing is, do you believe me? I believe Sue is pregnant, yes. That's enough. Enough for you to do what I've asked you to do. Go to Manshoff and make inquiries. See what he tells you. Don't make a scene, and for God's sake, don't mention my name. Just confirm my story for yourself. Then I'll give you further details. But when will I see you? Tomorrow afternoon, if you like, right here. You said he'd be sending another girl. Richie nodded. So I did, and so he'll say. I suggest you beg to be excused for the moment. Tell him it will take a while for you to get over the shock of losing Sue this way. I won't be lying, Harry murmured. I know, and I'm sorry. Believe me, I am. Richie sighed again. But you'll just have to trust me from now on. Trust you? When you haven't even explained what this is all about? You've had your shock therapy for today. Come back for another treatment tomorrow. And then Richie was gone, the gray uniform melting away into the gray shadows of the shrubbery above the bank. A short time later, Harry made his own way back to the center in the gathering twilight. The dusk was gray, too. Everything seemed gray now. So was Harry Collins's face when he emerged from his interview with Dr. Manshoff that evening. And it was still pallid the next afternoon when he came down to the river bank and waited for Richie to reappear. The little man emerged from the bushes. He stared at Harry's drawn countenance and nodded slowly. I was right, eh? He muttered. It looks that way, but I can't understand what's going on. If this isn't just a treatment center, if they're not really interested in my welfare, then what am I doing here? You're taking part in an experiment. This, my friend, is a laboratory, and you are a nice, healthy guinea pig. But that doesn't make sense. I haven't been experimented on. They've let me do as I please. Exactly. And what do guinea pigs excel at? Breeding. You mean this whole thing was rigged up just so that Sue and I would... Please, let's not be so egocentric, shall we? After all, you're not the only male patient in this place. There are a dozen others wandering around loose. Some of them have their favorite caves. Others have discovered little bypaths. But all of them seem to have located ideal trysting places, whereupon, of course, the volunteer nurses have located them. Are you telling me the same situation exists with each of the others? Isn't it fairly obvious? You've shown no inclination to become friendly with the rest of the patients here, and none of them have made any overtures to you. That's because everyone has his own little secret, his own private arrangement, and so all of you go around fooling everybody else, and all of you are being fooled. I'll give credit to Manshoff and his staff on that point. He's certainly mastered the principles of practical psychology. But you talked about breeding. With our present overpopulation problem, why in the world do they deliberately encourage the birth of more children? Very well put. Why in the world, indeed? In order to answer that, you'd better take a good look at the world. Arnold Ritchie seated himself on the grass, pulled out a pipe, and then replaced it hastily. Better not smoke, he murmured. Be awkward if we attracted any attention and were found together. Harry stared at him. You are a naturalist, aren't you? I'm a reporter by profession. Which network? No network. Newszines. There are still a few in print, you know. I know, but I can't afford them. There aren't many left who can, or who even feel the need of reading them. Nevertheless, mavericks like myself still cling to the ancient and honorable practice of the Fourth Estate, one of which is ferreting out the inside story, the news behind the news. Then you're not working for the naturalists? Of course I am. I'm working for them and everybody else who has an interest in learning the truth. Ritchie paused. By the way, you keep using that term as if it were some kind of dirty word. Just what does it mean? What is a naturalist in your book? Why, a radical thinker, of course, an opponent of government policies of progress, one who believes we're running out of living space, using up the last of our natural resources. What do you suppose motivates naturalists really? Well, they can't stand the pressures of daily living or the prospects of a future when we'll be still more hemmed in. Ritchie nodded. Any more than you could a few months ago when you tried to commit suicide. Wouldn't you say that you were thinking like a naturalist then? Harry grimaced. I suppose so. Don't feel ashamed. You saw the situation clearly, just as the so-called naturalists do, and just as the government does. Only the government can't dare admit it, hence the secrecy behind this project. A hush-hush government plan to stimulate further breeding? I still don't see... Look at the world, Ritchie repeated. Look at it realistically. What's the situation at present? Population close to 6 billion and rising fast. There was a leveling off period in the 60s, and then it started to climb again. No wars, no disease to cut it down. The development of synthetic foods, the use of algae and fungi rules out famine as a limiting factor. Increasing harnessing of atomic power has done away with widespread poverty. So there's no economic deterrent to propagation. Neither church nor state dares set up a legal prohibition. So here we are, at the millennium. In place of international tension, we've substituted internal tension. In place of thermonuclear explosion, we have a population explosion. You make it look pretty grim. I'm just talking about today. What happens 10 years from now when we hit a population level of 10 billion? What happens when we reach 20 billion, 50 billion, 100? Don't talk to me about more substitutes, more synthetics, new ways of conserving topsoil. There just isn't going to be room for everyone. Then what's the answer? That's what the government wants to know. Believe me, they've done a lot of searching, most of it sub rosa. And then along came this man, Leffingwell, with his solution. And that's just what it is. Of course, an endocrinological solution for direct injection. Leffingwell? The Dr. Leffingwell whose name was on that photostat? What's he got to do with this? He's boss of the project, Ritchie said. He's the one who persuaded them to set up a breeding center. You're his guinea pig. But why all the secrecy? That's what I wanted to know. That's why I scurried around, pulled strings to get a lab technician's job here. It wasn't easy, believe me. The whole deal is being kept strictly under wraps until Leffingwell's experiments prove out. They realized right away that it would be fatal to use volunteers for the experiments. They'd be bound to talk. There'd be leaks. And of course they anticipated some awkward results at first, until the technique is refined and perfected. Well, they were right on that score. I've seen some of their failures, Ritchie shuddered. Any volunteer, any military man, government employee, or even a so-called dedicated scientist who broke away would spread enough rumors about what was going on to kill the entire project. That's why they decided to use mental patients for subjects. God knows they had millions to choose from, but they were very particular. You're a rare specimen, Collins. How so? Because you happen to fit all their specifications. You're young, in good physical condition. Unlike 90% of the population, you don't even wear contact lenses, do you? And your aberration was temporary, easily removed by removing you from the tension sources which created it. You have no family ties, no close friends to question your absence. That's why you were chosen, one of the 200. 200? But there's only a dozen others here now. A dozen males, yes. You're forgetting the females. Must be about 50 or 60 in the other building. But if you're talking about someone like Sue, she's a nurse. Ritchie shook his head. That's what she was told to say. Actually, she's a patient too. They're all patients, 12 men and 60 women at the moment. Originally about 30 men and 170 women. What happened to the others? I told you there were some failures. Many of the women died in childbirth. Some of them survived but found out about the results. And the results, up until now, haven't been perfect. A few of the men found out too. Well, they have only one method of dealing with failure here. They dispose of them. I told you about that chimney, didn't I? You mean they killed the offspring? Killed those who found out about them? Ritchie shrugged. But what are they actually doing? Who is this Leffingwell? What's it all about? I think I can answer those questions for you. Harry wheeled at the sound of a familiar voice. Dr. Manshoff beamed down at him from the top of the riverbank. Don't be alarmed, he said. I wasn't following you with any intent to eavesdrop. I was merely concerned about him. His eyes flickered as he directed his gaze past Harry's shoulder, and Harry turned again to look at Arnold Ritchie. The little man was no longer standing, and he was no longer alone. Two attendants now supported him, one on either side, and Ritchie himself sagged against their grip with eyes closed. A hypodermic needle in one attendant's hand indicated the reason for Ritchie's sudden collapse. Merely a heavy sedative, Dr. Manshoff murmured. We came prepared in expectation of just such an emergency. He nodded at his companions. Better take him back now, he said. I'll look in on him this evening when he comes out of it. Sorry about all this, Manshoff continued, sitting down next to Harry as the orderlies lifted Richie's inert form and carried him up the slanting slope. It's entirely my fault. I misjudged my patient. Never should have permitted him such a degree of freedom. Obviously he's not ready for it yet. I do hope he didn't upset you in any way. No, he seemed quite... Harry hesitated, then went on hastily. Logical. Indeed he is, Dr. Manshoff smiled. Paranoid delusions, as they used to call them, can often be rationalized most convincingly. And from what little I heard, he was doing an excellent job, wasn't he? Well, I know. A slight sigh erased the smile. Leffingwell and I are mad scientists conducting biological experiments on human guinea pigs. We've assembled patients for breeding purposes, and the government is secretly subsidizing us. Also, we incinerate our victims, again, with full government permission. All very logical, isn't it? I didn't mean that, Harry told him. It's just that he said that Sue was pregnant, and he was hinting at things. Said? Manshoff stood up. Hinted? I'm surprised he didn't go further than that. Just today we discovered he'd been using the office facilities. He had a sort of probationary position, as you may have guessed, helping out the staff and administration, to provide tangible proof of his artistic creations. He was writing out official reports and then photostating them. Apparently he intended to circulate the results as evidence to support his delusions. Look, here's a sample. Dr. Manshoff passed a square of glossy paper to Harry, who scanned it quickly. It was another laboratory report similar to the one Richie had shown him, but containing a different set of names. No telling how long this sort of thing has been going on, Manshoff said. He may have made dozens. Naturally, the moment we discovered it, we realized prompt action was necessary. He'll need special attention. But what's wrong with him? It's a long story. He was a reporter at one time. He may have told you that. The death of his wife precipitated a severe trauma and brought him to our attention. Actually, I'm not at liberty to say any more regarding his case. You understand, I'm sure. Then you're telling me that everything he had to say was a product of his imagination? No, don't misunderstand. It would be more correct to state that he merely distorted reality. For example, there is a Dr. Leffingwell on the staff here. He is a diagnostician and has nothing to do with psychotherapy per se. And he has charge of the hospital ward in Unit 3, the third building, you may have noticed, behind administration. That's where the nurses maintain residence, of course. Incidentally, when any nurses take on a special assignment, as it were, such as yours, Leffingwell does examine and treat them. There's a new oral contraception technique he's evolved which may be quite efficacious. But I'd hardly call it an example of sinister experimentation under the circumstances, would you? Harry shook his head. About Richie, though, he said. What will happen to him? I can't offer any prognosis in view of my recent error in judgment concerning him. It's hard to say how he'll respond to further treatment, but rest assured that I'll do my best for his case. Chances are you'll be seeing him again before very long. Dr. Manshoff glanced at his watch. Shall we go back now, he suggested. Supper will be served soon. The two men toiled up the bank. Harry discovered that the doctor was right about supper. It was being served as he returned to his room. But the predictions concerning Richie didn't work out quite as well. It was after supper, indeed quite some hours afterward, while Harry sat at his window and stared sleeplessly out into the night, that he noted the thick, greasy spirals of black smoke rising suddenly from the chimneys of the third unit building. And the sight may have prepared him for the failure of Dr. Manshoff's prophecy regarding his disturbed patient. Harry never asked any questions, and no explanations were ever forthcoming. But from that evening onward, nobody ever saw Arnold Richie again. End of Chapter 2 of This Crowded Earth by Robert Bloch. Chapter 3 President Winthrop, 1999. The Secretary of State closed the door. Well, he asked. President Winthrop looked up from the desk and blinked. Hello, Art, he said. Sit down. Sorry I'm late, the Secretary told him. I came as soon as I got the call. It doesn't matter. The President lit a cigarette and pursed his lips around it until it stopped wobbling. I've been checking the reports all night. You look tired. I am. I could sleep for a week. That is, I wish I could. Any luck? The President pushed the papers aside and drummed the desk for a moment. Then he offered the Secretary a gray ghost of a smile. The answer's still the same. But this was our last chance. I know, the president leaned back. When I think of the time and effort, the money that's been poured into these projects, to say nothing of the hopes we had. And now, it's all for nothing. You can't say that, the secretary answered. After all, we did reach the moon. We got to Mars. He paused. No one can take that away from you. You sponsored the Martian flights. You fought for the appropriations, pushed the project, carried it through. You helped mankind realize its greatest dream. Save that for the newscasts, the president said. The fact remains we've succeeded, and our success was a failure. Mankind's greatest dream, eh? Read these reports and you'll find out this is mankind's greatest nightmare. Is it that bad? Yes. The president slumped in his chair. It's that bad. We can reach the moon at will. Now we can send a manned flight to Mars, but it means nothing. We can't support life in either place. There's absolutely no possibility of establishing or maintaining an outpost, let alone a large colony or a permanent human residence. That's what all the reports conclusively demonstrate. Every bit of oxygen, every bit of food and clothing and material would have to be supplied. And investigations prove there's no chance of ever realizing any return. The cost of such an operation is staggeringly prohibitive. Even if there was evidence to show it might be possible to undertake some mining projects, it wouldn't begin to defray expenses once you consider the transportation factor. But if they improved the rockets, managed to make room for a bigger payload, wouldn't it be cheaper? It would still cost roughly $1 billion to equip a flight and maintain a personnel of 20 men for a year, the president told him. I've checked into that, and even this estimate is based on the most optimistic projection. So you can see there's no use in continuing now. We'll never solve our problems by attempting to colonize the moon or Mars. But it's the only possible solution left to us. No, it isn't, the president said. There's always our friend Leffingwell. The Secretary of State turned away. You can't officially sponsor a thing like that, he muttered. It's political suicide. The gray smile returned to the gray lips. Suicide? What do you know about suicide, Art? I've been reading a few statistics on that, too. How many actual suicides do you think we had in this country last year? 100,000? 200, maybe? 2 million, the president leaned forward. Add to that over 1 million murders and 6 million crimes of violence. I never knew. Damned right you didn't. We used to have a Federal Bureau of Investigation to help prevent such things. Now the big job is merely to hush them up. We're doing everything in our power just to keep these matters quiet, or else there'd be utter panic. Then there's the accident total and the psycho rate. We can't build institutions fast enough to hold the mental cases, nor train doctors enough to care for them. Shifting them into other jobs in other areas doesn't cure, and it no longer even disguises what is happening. At this rate, another 10 years will see half the nation going insane, and it's like this all over the world. This is race suicide, Art. Race suicide through sheer fecundity. Leffingwell is right. The reproductive instinct unchecked will overbalance group survival in the end. How long has it been since you were out on the streets? The Secretary of State shrugged. You know I never go out on the streets, he said. It isn't very safe. Of course not, but it's no safer for the hundreds of millions who have to go out every day. Accident, crime, the sheer maddening proximity of the crowds. These phenomena are increasing through mathematical progression, and they must be stopped. Leffingwell has the only answer. They won't buy it, warned the secretary. Congress won't, and the voters won't any more than they bought birth control. And this is worse. I know that too. The president rose and walked over to the window, looking out at the skyscraper apartments which loomed across what had once been the mall. He was trying to find the dwarfed spire of Washington's monument in the tangled maze of stone. If I go before the people and sponsor Leffingwell, I'm through. Through as president, through with the party. They'll crucify me, but somebody in authority must push this project. That's the beginning. Once it's known, people will have to think about the possibilities. There'll be opposition, then controversy, then debate, and gradually Leffingwell will gain adherence. It may take 5 years, it may take 10. Finally, the change will come. First through volunteers, then by law. I only pray that it happens soon. They'll curse your name, the secretary said. They'll try to kill you. It's going to be hell. Hell for me if I do, yes. Worse hell for the whole world if I don't. But are you quite sure it will work? His method, I mean. You saw the reports on his tests, didn't you? It works all right. We've got more than just abstract data now. We've got films for the telescreenings all set up." "Films? You mean you actually show what the results are? Why, just telling the people will be bad enough, and admitting the government sponsored the project under wraps. But when they see, nothing on earth can save you from assassination." "Perhaps it doesn't really matter." The president crushed his cigarette in the ashtray. "One less mouth to feed, and I'm getting pretty sick of synthetic meals anyway." President Winthrop turned to the secretary, his eyes brightening momentarily. "Tell you what, Art, I'm not planning on breaking the proposal to the public until next Monday. What say we have a little private dinner party on Saturday evening? Just the cabinet members and their wives. Sort of a farewell celebration in a way, but we won't call it that, of course. Chef tells me there's still 20 pounds of hamburger in the freezers." 20 pounds of hamburger? You mean it?" The Secretary of State was smiling too. "That's right." The President of the United States grinned in anticipation. "Been a long time since I've tasted a real honest-to-goodness hamburger." End of Chapter 3 of This Crowded Earth by Robert Bloch. Chapter 4 Harry Collins, 2000. Harry didn't ask any questions. He just kept his mouth shut and waited. Maybe Dr. Manshoff suspected, and maybe he didn't. Anyway, there was no trouble. Harry figured there wouldn't be as long as he stayed in line and went through the proper motions. It was all a matter of pretending to conform, pretending to agree, pretending to believe. So he watched his step, except in his dreams, and then he was always falling into the yawning abyss. He kept his nose clean, but in the dreams he smelled the blood and brimstone of the pit. He managed to retain a cheerful smile at all times, though in the dreams he screamed. Eventually he met Myrna. She was the pretty little brunette whom Richie had mentioned, and she did her best to console him. Only in dreams, when he embraced her, he was embracing a writhing coil of slimy smoke. It may have been that Harry Collins went a little mad, just having to pretend that he was sane. But he learned the way, and he managed. He saved the madness, or was it the reality, for the dreams. Meanwhile, he waited and said nothing. He said nothing when, after 3 months or so, Myrna was suddenly transferred without warning. He said nothing when, once a week or so, he went to visit with Dr. Manshoff. He said nothing when Manshoff volunteered the information that Richie had been transferred to, or suggested that it would be best to stay on for further therapy. And he said nothing when still a third nurse came his way, a woman who was callid, complacent, and nauseatingly nymphomaniac. The important thing was to stay alive, and try to learn. It took him almost an additional year to find out what he wanted to find out. More than 8 months passed before he found a way of sneaking out of his room at night, and a way of getting into that third unit through a delivery door which was occasionally left open through negligence. Even then, all he learned was that the female patients did have their living quarters here, along with the members of the staff, and presumably Dr. Leffingwell. Many of the women were patients rather than nurses as claimed, and a good number of them were in various stages of pregnancy. But this proved nothing. Several times Harry debated the possibilities of taking some of the other men in his unit into his confidence. Then he remembered what had happened to Arnold Ritchie and decided against this course. The risk was too great. He had to continue alone. It wasn't until Harry managed to get into Unit 4 that he got what he wanted, what he didn't want, and learned that reality and dreams were one and the same. There was the night, more than a year after he'd come to the treatment center, when he finally broke into the basement and found the incinerators. And the incinerators led to the operating and delivery chambers. And the delivery chambers led to the laboratory. And the laboratory led to the incubators. And the incubators led to the nightmare. In the nightmare, Harry found himself looking down at the mistakes and the failures, and he recognized them for what they were, and he knew then why the incinerators were kept busy and why the black smoke poured. In the nightmare he saw the special units containing those which were not mistakes or failures, and in a way they were worse than the others. They were red and wriggling there beneath the glass, and on the glass surfaces hung the charts which gave the data. Then Harry saw the names, and saw his own name repeated twice, once for Sue, once for Myrna. and he realized that he had contributed to the successful outcome or issue of the experiments. Outcome? Issue? These horrors? And that was why Manshoff must have chosen to take the risk of keeping him alive, because he was one of the good guinea pigs, and he spawned living, mewing abominations. He had dreamed of these things, and now he saw that they were real, so that nightmare merged with now, and he gazed down at it with open eyes and screamed at last with open mouth. Then, of course, an attendant came running, although he seemed to be moving ever so slowly, because everything moves so slowly in a dream. And Harry saw him coming, and lifted a bell glass and smashed it down over the man's head, slowly, ever so slowly. And then he heard the others coming, and he climbed out of the window and ran. The searchlights winked across the courtyards, and the sirens vomited hysteria from metallic throats, and the night was filled with shadows that pursued. But Harry knew where to run. He ran straight through the nightmare, through all the fantastic but familiar convolutions of sight and sound, and then he came to the river and plunged in. Now the nightmare was not sight or sound, but merely sensation, icy cold and distilled darkness, ripples that ran and raced and roiled and roared. But there had to be a way out of the nightmare, and there had to be a way out of the canyon, and that way was the river. Apparently no one else had thought of the river. Perhaps they had considered it as a possible avenue of escape, and then discarded the notion when they realized how it ripped and raged among the rocks as it finally plunged from the canyon's mouth. Obviously no one could hope to combat that current and survive. But strange things happen in nightmares, and you fight the numbness and the blackness, and you claw and convulse, and you twist and turn and toss, and then you ride the crests of frenzy and plunge into the troughs of panic and despair. And you sweep round and sink down into nothingness until you break through to the freedom which comes only with oblivion. Somewhere beyond the canyon's moiling maw, Harry Collins found that freedom and that oblivion. He escaped from the nightmare, just as he escaped from the river. The river itself roared on without him, and the nightmare continued too. End of Chapter 4 of This Crowded Earth by Robert Bloch.